Briefly, I wanted to mention that there was a question in the question box last week. Somebody had asked if the Pali language was spoken anywhere. The Pali language, if you haven't heard, is the language in which the teachings of the historical Buddha were first committed, written down. Pali. And it seems to be a relatively good analog for the language that the Buddha probably spoke. But no, the answer is no. Pali is not spoken anywhere. Just FYI, whoever asked that question, or maybe it was somebody online. It is at this point a purely liturgical language. The entire Pali canon, whatever was recorded of the 49-year teaching history of the Buddha is written down in the Pali language. So thank you for your question. I appreciate it. And trust me, there are endless interesting rabbit holes to leap off and fly down about language and translation and all that stuff, if you're into that kind of thing. I wanted to open the floor for 5 minutes. If anybody had any questions, comments, or anything they're practicing with, or any questions about what we just did. That's a great question. The question is, do I have anything to say about where effort leaves off and struggle begins in the practice? I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that have something to say about that. There's so many different orientations to practice, but practicing in that way where we are applying some effort to stay with a meditation object, whether it's the breath or the sensations of the body or whatever, and then when the mind inevitably does something far more interesting at that moment, and then we bring it back, that's one way to practice. And it's a very common way and a very august and well-respected way. Another way of practicing, just throwing this out there, is whatever the mind and body does, that's what you're doing. So, it's very common in Buddhist meditation to be like, okay, meditate and then gather your attention on the breath, and when the mind wanders, bring it back to the breath. And that's probably 9 out of 10 books or pamphlets on meditation will say that, and that's great. And that's a very traditional way to practice in a concentration-oriented way, a shamatha way is the word commonly used, a way to kind of strengthen our ability to gather and place attention. But another way to practice is to sit with zero object. Don't even pick a meditation object. Like, don't even sit down with the idea of, I'm going to watch my breath. Just sit. And then whatever you do, just notice what you're doing. And that becomes your object. What is the difference between that and your ordinary experience? What is the difference between meditating like that and your ordinary experience moment to moment? I'm not really sure. Should there be a big difference between your meditation and the rest of your life? And I'm not trying to be flip. I think this is a really important question.
Well, there's something great that happens here.
I appreciate that. I don't know how to bottom line that for Zoom, but I'll say that Nick shared that some strange person told him that meditation could be the easiest part of his practice. Some ne'er-do-well, obviously, a rascal. And that was very significant for him. And then I'm going to go to thank you, and I think this is an ongoing question. And again, there's different orientations to practice, and they're not even necessarily different in kind. They're more different in. They're not qualitatively different. They're more quantitatively different. And this is something that I love. This is something I love breaking down, and maybe you just gave me an idea for some Mondays, is imagining meditation on different axes. And you can imagine like an X, Y. And so, I'm not good at math, but I think it's called a graph, and there's like an X-axis and a Y-axis. And you can imagine the X-axis being like lots of effort over here, very little effort over there. And then you could imagine the Y-axis being a very strong meditation object that's attended to with great regularity and diligence. And then down here, less and less of an object, to the point where awareness itself, as it is happening in the present moment, is the object. And not to say that one's better than the other. And then there's even like a Z-axis, a three-dimensional axis, where you've got, and I swear to God, I just had it. I need to write this down. X, Y, and Z. Oh, well, I'll think about it. But thank you very much. So that's a great question, and I can't imagine giving you an answer that would be satisfactory. But I just want to invite you to explore that question that you asked me. That's a profound question. What is the difference between my practice and the entire rest of my life? For the folks on Zoom, our dear friend Rob was talking about practice as a virtuosic activity, that working towards that time and place where it's not, for instance, the dancer and the danced, or the cook and the cooked. There's just dancing. There's just cooking, where you get out of the way and the duality gets softened and gets very porous. And that's beautiful. So this is like an interesting, there's a lot to say about that. And yeah, it's funny too, because especially at the beginning, there was actually a study done for people developing skill sets, and this was a neurological study that was done where they hooked them up, and they were measuring performance. And you'd have to go to Dr. Jay Garfield, who was the one who referenced this in a talk about emptiness. But what they found was, for people who were in the beginning to intermediate stages, getting regular tips while they were doing the activity was helpful and showed an improvement on what they were doing. But for intermediate to expert, it became distracting and their performance degraded when they were, getting tips and tricks from, whoever the audience, or, and it was, I think they might even have been doing it with golf or something like that. It was like, so, from, and so much of this is like a skill game, right? Like sitting still, living in a way that is cohesive with your values. I mean, that's a huge, it's funny because we don't often think about meditation as, we usually think of meditation as like, it's, you learn how to do, how to stay on the object, you learn how to do your breath, you learn how to watch this and how to count that and sit still, and that's all totally true. But so much of the Buddha's teachings, he draws a direct connection to, for instance, your conduct in your daily life and what your experience is when you sit. And so even just, you can imagine someone like Mr. Rogers, who I don't know that he ever studied meditation. Yeah, as far as I know, he was a Presbyterian minister. But God damn if he wasn't fully enlightened. I mean, his conduct and his heart was so pure that just effortless. Just every word out that man's mouth. And I just remember the third axis, the Z-axis, would be the size of your focal point, your aperture. So for instance, if you're sitting, and I know this is the situation with me, when I'm trying to meditate, and I'm getting in my own way, very often my tendency is to squeeze, and I try to drill down, and like I make my focus smaller, and I'm like, okay, just the nose, and I don't even I'm not even thinking about it, I'm just doing it, I'm like, and I'm making the area of my focus smaller. But there's this wonderful teacher who's no longer with us named Rob Burbea, and one day I was listening to a talk he gave me. He said, do the opposite. Think of it like an unruly horse. You need to give it more pasture. So if you are trying to sit and the mind is bucking and getting itchy and anxious and edgy, just go from like the nose to the nose and the chest or the entire body. Feel the breath in the whole body. Feel the entire surface of your skin. Blow it out into the room. Your mind has made a 3D model of this entire room from the second you walked in. It's called proprioception and motor planning. There's a whole ass part of your brain, and that's its job. So every single one of you can see this whole room. And not all of us are as visual as some others, and not all of us have sat in here for days and days and days. But there's a part of your brain that can locate you in this room. So it'd be very easy, instead of being the sensation of the in-breath in the right nostril. If that's too small for the mind, blow it out. It could even be the entire room. Your awareness filling this whole room, to the walls, to the ceiling, and the floor, and let that be your object. So one of these days I'm going to make a 3D model of this with toothpicks. And it's going to be, so thank you. Yes, sir.